"Old man, step aside. This is a SEAL base, not a nursing home." The shout slammed straight down onto the parade ground, cold and sharp like a firing order. Hundreds of recruits stood at attention, sweat running down their spines, while Elias Voss, 75 years old, was dragged into the frame like a cheap source of amusement. Admiral Richard Hales sneered, leaning close to his face, his voice dripping with contempt. "Just for fun. Back then, did you even have a call sign, or were you just some lowly logistics grunt?" Laughter burst out, scattered at first, then spreading across the entire field. An old man, a joke, a perfect display of dominance, but only a few seconds later, just a single offbeat moment, Elias Voss raised his head. His gaze was so calm it was chilling. His voice was hoarse, low, not trembling at all. "My call sign was Night Fox." The laughter died in their throats. The Admiral's face went pale. An officer whispered, "That name, it was sealed. Night Fox, the man who once led missions that were not allowed to fail, the one whose name history was forced to erase, and he was standing right here. If you were Elias Voss, would you stay silent to protect yourself, or stand up and drag an abusive system into the light? If a single name can freeze headquarters in silence, how many truths are still buried? Don't scroll past. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me, would you stay silent, or speak up when power crosses the line? Late autumn afternoon settled over Little Creek Base with a deep red light, the kind of light that made every edge of the parade ground appear sharp and cold. The wide expanse of concrete reflected the sunset like a gigantic mirror, a place where discipline was carved into every step and every breath. Hundreds of recruits and officers stood in neat formation, uniforms crisply pressed, eyes fixed straight ahead. That orderly surface created a false sense of safety, concealing a truth tightly suppressed beneath it. 2 weeks earlier, recruit Jake Thompson died in the SEAL training area. The official report concluded that the cause was personal depression. From that moment on, the name Jake vanished from every public conversation, as if he had never stood on this ground. The heavy atmosphere pressed down on everyone's chest. Sweat ran down the spines of the recruits, soaking through the fabric, gathering at their collars, then dripping down. Even as the sea wind blew continuously, they stood motionless by command, feet planted, arms pressed tight against their bodies. The silence was not peaceful. It was like a solid block of metal, crushing every thought that tried to surface. A young recruit swallowed hard, his throat dry and burning, eyes still staring forward, but his breathing slipping out of formation. He could feel each beat of his heart, strong and rapid, as if his body were betraying the order to remain calm. In the rear row, a junior officer bent his head close to a fellow officer's ear, his voice so low it barely slipped through the sound of the wind. "Jake is dead," he said quickly, his eyes flicking forward as if afraid the very words he had just spoken might be caught. A brief pause, then the next sentence came out, drier and harsher, but it's as if he never existed. The listener froze, jaw tightening. There were no questions, no objections. Both understood the unwritten law operating here, a law written in power and fear. The American flag flew high on a steel pole at the center of the parade ground, snapping hard in the sea wind. The sound of fabric striking the air was clear and steady, like another heartbeat of the base. Red, white, and blue stood out against the blazing orange sky of dusk, forming a stark contrast with the motionless faces below. That image was meant to remind people of honor and ideals, but in this moment, it looked like a backdrop, covering a truth that was being forced into silence. The internal loudspeakers lined along the field suddenly crackled to life. The voice that followed was flat and emotionless, cutting through the wind. According to the conclusion of the review board, the cause leading to the death of recruit Jake Thompson was personal depression. There were no signs of misconduct in the training process. Each word was broadcast clearly and precisely, like a stamp pressed onto a file. When the final sentence ended, the speakers fell silent. There was no murmuring, no public reaction, only eyes that wavered for a fraction of a second before locking straight ahead again. A recruit in the third row clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His lips moved, a sentence slipping out very softly, as if spoken only to himself. What if it were me? The question dissolved into the air, never reaching the ears of any officer. It hovered in his mind, dragging along images of Jake from days before, his face pale after prolonged training sessions, his eyes trying to appear steady when asked how he was. He recalled the moment Jake collapsed on the training ground, the whistle sounding, and then everything being rushed to avoid attention. The sound of boot heels striking concrete rang out sharply. The training officer walked along the ranks, his cold gaze sweeping across each face. When he stopped in front of a group of recruits, he spoke in a deep, heavy voice, loud enough for all to hear. Heads up, SEALs have no place for weakness. The words fell like an absolute command. A few recruits adjusted their posture, chins lifting slightly higher, backs straighter, even though cracks of fear still lingered in their eyes. Another officer stepped closer, his voice low but clear, directed at the training group. Anyone who spreads unofficial information will face discipline. The record is clear. After speaking, he turned away, leaving behind a series of averted gazes. No one mentioned Jake again in the ranks. His name vanished from the space, as if by not speaking it aloud, that death would simply fade away. The parade ground continued the ceremony according to schedule. Commands were shouted, synchronized, and precise. Left turns and right turns were executed smoothly, but behind that precision spread a growing sense of emptiness. A few recruits exchanged fleeting glances, filled with the same unspoken understanding and fear. They understood that there were questions not meant to be asked, deaths allowed to exist on paper, but erased from collective memory. As dusk deepened, the light faded, and shadows stretched across the concrete. The American flag still flew. The sound of fabric still beat steadily, but the silence had grown thicker. It needed no reminder, no command. It operated on its own as an unwritten law, forcing everyone to bow their heads before a conclusion already stamped and sealed. Jake Thompson, with everything he had endured, was compressed into a single cold line in a report. At the edge of the field, near the base gate, security lights began to switch on. Guards changed shifts, short regulation greetings ringing out. While the truth was being buried alive beneath ceremonies and shouted commands, an outsider was stepping through the base gate, carrying the past and something no report could ever erase. Elias Voss stepped through the gate of Little Creek Base as the sunset had shifted into a deep orange hue. He paused briefly to present his veteran identification card, an old plastic card worn and scratched by time. The guard glanced at it, checked it quickly, then handed it back, his eyes indifferent, as if processing a familiar routine. "Go straight along the path on the right," the soldier said, his voice flat and dry. Eli nodded and walked through without looking back. The metal gate closed behind him, separating him from the outside world and drawing him into a space where memory and the present collided. The concrete yard opened up before him, wide and level, with straight white lines guiding the way. Eli walked slowly, his back slightly hunched, yet each step still kept a steady rhythm, as though his body remembered very clearly how to move across surfaces like this. He heard the steady thud of boots from aft, and the sound of sea wind rushing through the rows of training buildings. The scent of salt mixed into the air, stirring memories of long-ago evenings on other coastlines, places where he had once stood waiting for orders with a heart beating far harder than it did now. Along the way, several recruits passed by, eyes forward, posture precise. They noticed him, an old man with white hair, looking out of place amid iron discipline, then quickly looked away. A young officer strode past, casting a sideways glance and muttering just loudly enough for the companion beside him to hear. Another nostalgic old man. The words drifted away with their footsteps. Eli heard them, but his expression did not change. He continued walking, his gaze fixed on the main hall at the far end of the yard, where the lights were beginning to turn on. Beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the yard stood a few wooden benches, set slightly off the main axis. It was a place few people noticed, far enough to avoid curious looks, close enough to observe every movement. Eli chose one bench and sat down slowly. The wood creaked softly under his weight. He leaned back and exhaled a long breath, feeling the sea breeze brush across his cheek, carrying the faint chill of the late afternoon. Eli's hand unconsciously touched the pocket of his jacket. His fingers found the small envelope. Its paper cover softened from being handled so many times. He kept his hand there for a moment, as if weighing something, then let go. The envelope remained in his pocket, discreet and heavier than its actual weight. Inside was a message he had been trusted to deliver in person, something he knew would disrupt the false calm of this place when the right moment came. Eli lifted his head and looked toward the main hall. The glass doors reflected the sunset, forming overlapping patches of light and shadow. He recalled the last time he had met Roy Miller, also in a similar space, many years ago. Roy had stood straight then, his voice firm, his eyes unflinching. Time had taken many things from them, but Eli believed some things remained intact, such as loyalty and responsibility to those who had fallen. The silver ring on Eli's hand glinted faintly as the final rays of the day touched it. The face of the ring was engraved with a small fox, its lines worn smooth, yet the shape still clear. He gently turned the ring, feeling the cool metal against his skin, an old habit, whenever he had to wait, whenever memories came rushing back. images of long nights, missions that allowed no mistakes, and the faces of comrades surfaced and then faded with each breath. The sea wind grew stronger, the oak leaves rustling overhead. The sound made the space seem to tremble slightly. A sense of unease crept in, vague, yet distinct. Eli sensed movement around him, the rhythm of the bass beginning to change. There were more footsteps, scattered conversations drifting from the direction of the hall. He glanced at the watch on his wrist, the second hand inching forward steadily. Roy had not appeared yet. In the distance, a group of officers gathered, exchanging quick words, their expressions tense. Eli caught fragments of speech, training, reports, and internal communications. He did not need to hear clearly to understand that something was being arranged. This base was accustomed to controlling appearances, to orchestrating what was allowed to be seen. He had witnessed it far too many times in his life. A young recruit passed by the oak tree, slowed his pace slightly, and looked at Eli. The boy's eyes hesitated for a moment. "Sir," he said softly, his voice still youthful. "Are you waiting for someone?" Eli looked at him and nodded gently. "A friend." The recruit nodded back, as if wanting to say something more, then stopped himself. He adjusted his posture and walked on, leaving behind an unspoken uncertainty. Time passed, and the light shifted from orange to pale purple. The yard lights came on row by row, casting even circular pools of light across the concrete. Eli remained seated, silent, yet his presence was anything but faint. He was like an anchor, standing outside the hurried flow, waiting for the right moment. The sound of engines rose from a side gate. Eli turned his head. A convoy of black vehicles entered, moving slowly but decisively, followed by several high-ranking officers. The way they stepped out, the way they stood together, made it clear this was no chance meeting. He recognized the signs of power, a familiar power that had once decided the fates of many. Eli stood up and adjusted his posture. The envelope in his jacket pocket seemed heavier. He looked toward the approaching group, his gaze calm, yet marked by clear readiness. He had not even had time to wait for Roy to appear beneath the oak tree when that powerful group had already drawn near, carrying with them an entirely different atmosphere, signaling that the silence was about to be broken. The convoy came to a stop near the main hall, engines shutting down simultaneously, leaving behind a taut, rigid silence. The vehicle doors opened, and Richard Hale stepped out first, the courtyard lights reflecting off a face long familiar from speeches and internal broadcasts. He took a few steps forward and stopped at precisely the spot with the most favorable camera angle. The officers following him immediately spread out, forming a neat, orderly composition. The internal camera switched on its indicator light, the lens aimed straight at Hale, ready to record every gesture. Hale swept his gaze around, quickly taking in the space. When he noticed Eli standing near the oak tree, he paused for half a beat. Then a smile spread across his face. Almost instantly, he walked over, raising his hand higher than usual, his voice projecting loudly enough for the camera to capture it in full. "We always value our veterans," Hale said, each word clear, emphasized at just the right moments. The sentence rang out across the courtyard like a slogan that had already been rehearsed. The camera shifted, zooming in for a close-up. Hale took Eli's hand and squeezed it firmly, holding on longer than necessary. That hand was not seeking agreement. It held tight to ensure Eli fit neatly within the frame. The lights shone directly on them, highlighting the contrast between Hale's smile and Eli's composed gaze. A nearby officer signaled for the camera to adjust its angle, making sure the handshake became the center of the shot. Hale turned slightly, still holding Eli's hand, and spoke more loudly, as if addressing an invisible crowd. "The older generation built this great foundation," he said, his free hand lightly gesturing toward the rows of training buildings behind them. "Because of them, we have today." The phrasing was smooth and familiar, perfectly suited for broadcasts meant to spread quickly. The camera captured every expression, every nod from the officers standing behind him, as though all were in complete agreement. Eli could clearly feel the slight pull on his wrist as Hale adjusted his position, drawing him into the center of the frame. He did not speak, nor did he pull his hand away. His eyes briefly passed over the lens, then turned back toward the hall. Eli's silence did not disrupt the script. It was treated merely as background detail, easily drowned out by Hale's voice. At the edge of the scene, a young officer leaned close to a colleague, his voice low but urgent. "The Admiral is diverting attention from the Jake incident," he said quickly. The other gave a small nod, eyes still fixed on the camera. They understood that the image being constructed was meant to replace unanswered questions. that the timely appearance of an elderly veteran was no coincidence. Hale released Eli's hand, and then gave his shoulder a light pat, a gesture just intimate enough for the camera to register. "You think the base is better now than it was before, don't you?" Hale asked, his tone carrying a hint of a laugh, as if engaging in friendly conversation. The question was not meant to seek an answer. It was designed to steer toward a favorable affirmation. Eli turned to look at Hale, his gaze calm. "I came to visit a friend," he replied evenly, without raising his voice. The answer was brief and unscripted. For an instant, the smile on Hale's face froze. It was a very short moment, enough for those nearby to notice, but easily missed on screen if one was not paying attention. Hale quickly regained his expression, smiling more broadly, as though he had just heard something amusing. "It's wonderful to see relationships like that still being maintained," Hale said, turning back to the camera, his voice returning to its familiar rhythm. He signaled with his eyes, and the camera shifted slightly, capturing a few more shots of the officers standing at attention behind him, creating a sense of unity and solemnity. Meanwhile, Eli stepped back half a pace, giving the space back to Hale. He glanced toward the oak tree where he had been waiting, then looked again toward the hall. His presence had fulfilled the role Hale needed in that moment, a living prop, sufficient to drape the base in a layer of positive imagery at exactly the right time. The camera continued recording a few more brief remarks. Hale spoke about tradition, about responsibility, about care for people. Every word was carefully chosen, avoiding any mention of Jake's death. The officers behind him maintained perfect posture, eyes forward. No one interrupted, no one asked questions. When the recording signal ended, the indicator light on the camera went dark. The coordinator signaled for the internal media crew to withdraw and pack up their equipment. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. The prepared smiles faded, replaced by the familiar stern expressions. Hale turned, looking directly at Eli, his eyes no longer needing to perform. A colonel stepped forward and whispered something into Hale's ear. Hale gave a slight nod, then looked back at Eli, his gaze sharper and colder than before. The distance between them seemed to shrink, even though neither took another step. The parade ground returned to its usual rhythm, but the tension still hung in the air. Eli stood still, arms relaxed at his sides, his gaze unwavering. He clearly sensed the shift, from stage to backstage, from polished words to what was about to be exposed. He knew that what would follow would be entirely different from what the camera had just recorded. If you see power using the vulnerable as props, follow this story through to the end. Hale turned his back and signaled for the officers to follow. As the group began moving away from the camera area, Hale's voice dropped, no longer projecting for an audience. He paused for half a beat, as if weighing something, then turned back, his eyes resting on Eli a moment longer. The smile had vanished completely. The main camera departed, leaving the parade ground under cold white lights. The words spoken moments earlier had not yet settled when a different atmosphere moved in, heavier and more direct. Hale's true face began to emerge, signaling that the minutes to come would no longer fit within the bounds of a performance. When the camera crew left, the parade ground changed its face. Cold white lights poured down onto the concrete, exposing the rigid lines of a space accustomed to commands. Richard Hale stopped in the middle of the walkway and spun around sharply. His voice burst out, loud and harsh, without the need for a microphone, powerful enough to slam straight into the ranks, standing at attention. "Who allowed this old man in here?" The question rang out, heavy, like a blow. Several officers flinched, their eyes immediately shifting toward Eli. The gate officer went pale. He stepped forward, half a pace, lips moving as he searched for words. "Sir Admiral, he has a valid veteran identification card," and, according to procedure, the sentence was cut off before it could be completed by an impatient wave of the hand. Hale looked at him, his gaze sharp and cold. "Your procedure is allowing outsiders into a critical training area," he said, his voice lowered but heavy with pressure. "Do you understand the consequences?" Eli stood still, the distance between him and Hale, now only a few steps. He did not retreat, nor did he advance. "I came to visit an old friend," Eli said evenly, offering no further explanation. He looked straight ahead, his gaze unwavering. The brief reply made a few officers behind him shift slightly, as if they were waiting for the next eruption. Hale snorted, the corner of his mouth curling upward. "And, which department does your friend work in?" he asked, drawing out the final word, turning the question into mockery rather than inquiry. A young officer nearby let out a short, awkward laugh, a reflex meant to curry favor. A few others did not laugh, but their eyes wavered, weighing which reaction would be the safest. Hale took another step forward, narrowing the gap. He leaned in close to Eli, his voice lowered, clear enough for those nearby to hear. Which unit were you in? His eyes scanned Eli's face, as if searching for a weakness to latch onto. He paused for a beat, then continued, his tone now openly malicious. Did you have a call sign? The question dropped onto the parade ground not to receive an answer, but to display power. Hundreds of recruits remained standing at attention, backs straight, chins lifted according to regulation. They heard every word. Some clenched their fists, some swallowed hard. No one turned their head, but the tension spread quickly like an undercurrent. A senior officer standing beside Hale glanced toward the ranks, then turned back, his voice low but clear. Sir Admiral, perhaps we should. Hale raised a hand to stop him, his eyes never leaving Eli. This is an internal matter, he said. Everyone, stay in your positions. The order was delivered lightly, but no one dared disobey. Eli could clearly feel the atmosphere shift. Eyes that had once been neutral now carried scrutiny. He knew exactly what Hale was doing. In front of subordinates and recruits, Hale needed a target to make an example of, to reinforce the message that power here was absolute, that anyone outside the system could be diminished in an instant. Can't answer, can you? Hale pressed on, his voice laced with ridicule. Or is there nothing in your past worth mentioning? He turned halfway toward the ranks, as if delivering a live lesson. You see, Hale said louder, there are people who cling to memories, but in reality, they have no value left in the present. A few young officers nodded instinctively. Another avoided Eli's eyes. The silence dragged on, heavy and oppressive. The sea wind swept across the ground, carrying the sound of fabric flags, snapping hard against their poles. The noise seemed louder than usual, like a deliberate accent marking the pause. Eli inhaled slowly, then exhaled. He looked across the line of recruits, saw their young faces, and saw the tension in their eyes. He realized this was no longer a personal exchange. Every word Hale spoke was meant to send a message to them, that this system did not tolerate questions, that honor could be used, twisted, and discarded when convenient. You should know your place, Hale said, turning back to face Eli. This is an active base. We do not receive sentimental visits. He paused, then added, his voice lowered, sharp as a blade, especially from those who think their past gives them the right to speak. The gate officer stepped back, his face still pale. He glanced briefly at Eli, a trace of remorse in his eyes, then quickly lowered his head. He understood that any words now could pull him into trouble. Fear functioned efficiently, forcing people to self-correct, to avoid danger. Hale turned to the group of nearby officers. You see, he said, discipline is what keeps this base running. Anyone who disrupts order, no matter who they are, must be held accountable. The statement echoed out, designed to close the matter, yet his eyes remained fixed on Eli, as if waiting for a reaction. Eli did not respond. He stood straighter, shoulders opening, his gaze maintaining its calm. His silence was not avoidance. It made Hale frown, as if part of his stage had been taken away. Hale tilted his head and smiled thinly. Or have you forgotten who you once were, he asked, dragging out the words, trying to provoke humiliation. In the ranks, a young recruit felt his heartbeat quicken. He heard every word, felt the imbalance of power laid bare before him. He understood that the question was not meant to learn anything about the man standing before Hale. It was meant to crush, to push Eli into the lowest possible position. Under the gaze of everyone present, the space seemed to shrink around the two men. Hale stood there, waiting, convinced he held complete control. Eli stood opposite him, his expression unchanged. The question had been released like a spark. It hung suspended over the parade ground, signaling that the next moment would determine the direction of everything that followed. The pause that fell after Richard Hale's question lasted longer than expected. It was not a pleasant quiet, but a weighted silence, pressing down on everyone standing on the parade ground. Eli lowered his gaze, his head slightly bowed, as if accepting the position Hale had just imposed on him. One of his hands rested on the edge of a nearby wooden bench, his fingers gradually closing tighter, the tendons standing out clearly beneath skin thinned by age. The movement was small, but enough for those standing close by to notice the tension being contained, deliberately kept from spilling outward. Hale saw everything. He stood upright, shoulders squared, acutely aware of the attention focused on him. Eli's silence was interpreted by Hale in the way most favorable to himself. He believed the man before him had been driven into a corner, that the questions just asked had done the necessary work. The corner of Hale's mouth curled upward, his smile spreading, this time without any need for concealment. You see, he said loudly, his voice steady and carrying far enough for the ranks behind to hear clearly. There's nothing to tell. A few young officers let out quiet laughs, not in unison, but enough to create a sense of agreement. Others remained silent, eyes fixed straight ahead, unwilling to show any reaction that might be interpreted as inappropriate. This system was accustomed to swift rewards and punishments. They had learned that safety lay in blending into the crowd. Eli kept his head lowered, his fingers tightened further, knuckles turning white, then slowly relaxed. He gently turned the silver ring on his ring finger, the fox-shaped face, catching the lights of the parade ground and flashing briefly. The gesture was familiar, a way of keeping his breathing steady. The sea wind swept through, lightly stirring the hem of his coat, carrying with it the scent of salt and the chill of the late afternoon. In the line of recruits, a young man swallowed hard. His throat was dry and raw, his eyes still staring forward, but his mind was no longer on the commands. He heard every word Hale spoke, saw clearly the imbalance of power laid bare before him. A sense of injustice rose quietly, difficult to name. He thought of Jake Thompson, thought of training sessions stretched to the point of exhaustion, thought of how that death had been reduced to a single line in a report. He did not dare turn his head, did not dare show anything, but the silence at this moment made him feel choked. Hale drew in a breath, as if he had just completed a successful performance. He cast one last glance at Eli, his eyes skimming over the deeply lined face. "A waste of time," Hale said, his voice returning to the familiar cadence of command. He turned his back, signaling the officers to follow. The movement was decisive, clearly marking an end. To Hale, this moment was closed. He believed his authority had just been reinforced by another layer, right before the eyes of those who needed to see it. The subordinate officers quickly adjusted their positions, falling in behind Hale. No one spoke up in Eli's defense. A few glances flicked toward him, hesitating for a fraction of a second, then immediately turned away. Fear operated smoothly, guiding each individual to choose silence to protect their own standing. This base had been built on such principles for a very long time. The wind suddenly grew stronger, snapping the American flag taut on its tall pole. The sound of fabric striking the air rang out sharply, rapid and insistent, like the beat of a driving drum. The noise spread across the ground, touching pockets of silence that had not yet dissipated. Shadows stretched across the concrete, intertwining and overlapping, forming distorted shapes. Eli still stood there, his head bowed low. He heard Hale's footsteps moving away, heard the boots of the officers following. He heard the wind, the flag, the steady sound of his own breathing. The silence surrounding him now carried a different meaning. It was no longer an enforced void, but a point of compression, accumulated long enough to become dangerous. A gate officer standing not far away glanced toward Eli. Confusion was clearly visible in his eyes. He remembered the moment he had let Eli into the base, remembered the worn veteran identification card, remembered the brief statement about visiting a friend. He wondered what it was he had just witnessed. He did not dare step forward, nor did he dare turn away immediately. In the end, he lowered his head, returned to his post, choosing the safest option. The line of recruits remained at attention. A few sensed a very slight change in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. They did not know what was about to happen, but instinct told them that this moment was not over. The silence stretched on for a few more beats, long enough for everyone to believe that Hale had won, that Eli had been crushed beneath the weight of authority. Then, just as Hale had completely turned his back, Eli raised his head. The movement was slow and decisive, his eyes lifted, unhurried, unwavering. His hand left the edge of the bench, his fingers relaxed, the silver ring settling into its familiar position. The wind continued to blow. The flag remained taut, but the space itself seemed to pause for an instant. The dangerous silence had fulfilled its role. It had just ended, opening into another moment, one in which everything that had been held in check from the beginning began to find a way out. The moment Eli raised his head, the parade ground seemed to be held suspended between two breaths. Richard Hale had already turned his back, his foot just leaving his previous position, convinced that the story had ended exactly the way he wanted. Then Eli's hoarse voice sounded from behind him, not loud, not emphasized, yet every syllable cut straight into the taut, rigid space. "My call sign is Night Fox." The sound did not carry far. It dropped and stopped, like a stone released onto a surface of frozen water. The laughter that still lingered on the lips of several officers froze halfway. Their jaws closed, their throats tightened, the air seeming to be sucked out of their chests. Eyes that moments earlier had been filled with smug satisfaction shifted into confusion, then settled on Eli, as if they were looking at an object that had just changed its shape. Hale spun around. The movement was far too fast for his age, and for the composure he usually displayed. His face drained of color, the skin tightening, his eyes widening beyond normal. For a very brief instant, every layer of emotional control vanished. It was the reflex of someone who had just heard something he knew intimately, so deeply that it required no thought to recognize. A young officer standing nearby whispered, his voice barely forming words, "That name, in the classified files." Part of the sentence was carried away by the wind, but it was enough for those beside him to hear. They glanced at one another, unease clearly visible in their eyes. A few of them rummaged through hazy memories of theoretical training sessions, of names that were mentioned in passing, and then quickly abandoned, as if they were not meant to be examined too closely. The atmosphere on the parade ground changed distinctly. The wind still blew. The flag was still taut, but the sound seemed to be pushed farther away. The silence was no longer imposed. It became a staggering void. Eli straightened his back, his shoulders opening, his posture no longer bearing the slight stoop of moments before. His gaze was cold and clear, directed straight at Hale. That calm was not a challenge. It was more like a confirmation. Hale opened his mouth, but no sound came out at all. He swallowed dryly, his throat moving. The flow of war memories surfaced clearly on his face, like an old film suddenly rewound. Long nights, reports stamped top secret, names crossed out from public lists. Night Fox was not a vague legend told for amusement. It was a code name that had once been spoken in sealed rooms, places where mistakes were not allowed to exist. A lieutenant colonel stepped forward half a pace, his voice cautious. "Admiral," he just said. The sentence trailed off. Hale raised his hand to stop him, palm facing downward, the gesture stiff and abrupt. He did not look at the man who had spoken. His eyes remained locked on Eli. "Silence," Hale said, his voice deeper now, no longer as sharp as before. The order did not need to be loud because at that moment, everyone was listening. Hale took one step forward, narrowing the distance between them. He studied Eli's face more closely, as if searching for a sign to refute what he had just heard. The wrinkles, the gray hair, the aged appearance, all of it was correct. But there was something else. Something Hale recognized very clearly, something that did not change with time. It was the eyes of someone who had made decisions in situations where hesitation had no place. "You," Hale stopped, his voice turning hoarse. "What are you saying?" The question sounded like an attempt to reclaim control, but it lacked force. Eli did not answer immediately. He held the gaze, letting the silence do its work. A few officers behind them began to murmur, but no one dared to speak loudly. Night Fox. That name was tied to missions where failure meant there was no chance to correct the mistake. Deep infiltration behind enemy lines, hostage rescues, under unfavorable conditions, elimination of high-value targets, followed by disappearance. The reports ended with brief lines, no detailed descriptions, no recognition of merit in the usual way. These were operations permitted to exist, but the people who carried them out were not. Hale stepped back half a pace. The movement was very small, but it was enough for those standing nearby to notice. A young officer saw it, his eyes widening. Then he quickly lowered his head. The familiar order was shaken. What Hale had done earlier, the insults, the mocking questions, suddenly became dangerous in a way he had not anticipated. Eli spoke again, his voice still steady. "I am saying exactly what you asked." The sentence was short, carrying no trace of boasting. It shifted the center of the exchange, from a stage of authority to a reality Hale could not control. Several recruits in the back ranks felt a chill run down their spines. They did not fully understand the meaning of the name, but they sensed the reaction of the command staff, and that was enough to know that something very large had just been stirred. Hale raised his hand and adjusted his collar out of habit, then let it fall when he realized the gesture was useless. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his rhythm. "You think saying a name is enough to..." Hale stopped, the sentence unfinished. He realized he was stepping onto a dangerous boundary. Every word at that moment could become evidence of panic. An older officer, one who had served for many years, looked at Eli with a completely different expression. He said nothing, but in his eyes there was a slow recognition, like a final piece sliding into place. He remembered special training sessions, remembered names spoken softly, accompanied by instructions not to ask further questions. Night Fox was one of them. "Do you think a name can make an entire system tremble? Do not leave." The parade ground was now completely silent. Hundreds of recruits stood at attention, but their focus was no longer on commands. It was fixed on the two figures facing each other on one side, the present authority, on the other, a past that history had been forced to erase. The wind blew harder. The American flag stretched tight, the sound of fabric snapping more clearly, as if underscoring the tension that was rising. Hale knew it well. His gaze swept quickly over Eli, then stopped, no trace of his earlier contempt remaining. He understood that the man before him was not a lost old soldier. This was someone who had once stood in a place where every decision left lasting consequences, and in this moment, with a single sentence, the entire base had been frozen, opening a chain of events that Hale could no longer stop with ordinary authority. After the name Night Fox rang out, the familiar order on the parade ground no longer functioned smoothly. Richard Hale stood in the middle of the aisle, his body slightly tense, his eyes darting faster than before. He let out a harsh laugh, the sound abrupt and uneven. "You think you can just say a random name and get away with it," Hale said, forcing his voice louder to drown out the unease rising inside him. The sound carried, but it no longer weighted his earlier commands. Hale swept his gaze across the field, looking at the recruits, at the subordinate officers, as if searching for confirmation. "You actually believe fairy tales," he continued, his voice rising, stressing the final word. A few young officers glanced at one another, hesitant. No one answered. This silence was not obedience. It was the pause of people who had just realized that something did not add up. At the edge of the formation, a young officer leaned close to a colleague's ear and whispered quickly, "But the Admiral's reaction is strange." The other did not reply, only frowned. Both had seen the moment Hale spun around, seen the color drain from his face, seen the tiny step backward he could not fully hide. Those details did not belong in rehearsed displays of authority, and precisely because of that, they bred suspicion. Hale turned toward Eli, his eyes struggling to maintain their contemptuous look. "Night Fox died a long time ago," he said, hammering each word, as if reading from a stamped conclusion. "That name exists only in fabricated stories." The statement was thrown out to block any further developments, to lock the situation in place, right here. Eli looked at Hale, his gaze unchanged. "Some people only disappear on paper," he said, his voice low and clear. The answer was not long, not argumentative. It placed a different truth on the table, forcing listeners to measure it themselves. A few officers behind him shifted slightly. One swallowed hard. No one laughed. Sweat began to bead at Hale's temples. He lifted a hand by reflex, then lowered it when he realized how exposed the gesture was. His breathing grew heavier. The denials he had just issued did not bring the sense of safety he had hoped for. They felt like hastily applied patches, unable to cover a crack spreading fast. "That's enough," Hale growled, switching to command. "Guards, remove him from the area." The voice carried the habit of long years of authority, but this time, it lacked its usual certainty. Two security personnel nearby exchanged glances, then stepped forward. Their footsteps were steady, but hesitation showed clearly in their eyes. They had heard the name that had just been spoken, had seen Hale's reaction, and understood that this was not an ordinary situation. Eli remained still as the two men approached. He neither stepped back nor forward. The parade ground fell completely silent. Hundreds of recruits maintained perfect posture, but their attention was no longer on commands. It converged on the center, where an order was being carried out in an atmosphere thick with doubt. "Admiral," a lieutenant colonel stepped half a pace forward, his voice cautious. "Perhaps we should." The sentence broke off. Hale turned, his gaze sharp and cold. "Are you questioning my order?" Hale asked, lowering his voice. The officer fell silent and stepped back. No one wanted to become the next target in a moment when authority was wavering. The two guards stopped in front of Eli. One spoke, keeping his tone strictly formal. "Sir, please, come with us." Eli looked at them and gave a very slight nod. He understood that the order had been given, and that resistance now would only heighten the tension. He turned, half a step, but before he could move, Hale spoke again. "You see," Hale said loudly, addressing the formation, "those who cling to the past will find every way to cause trouble. This base is not a place for such games." He tried to reclaim his lecturing role, but his voice no longer produced the same effect as before. Some recruits stared straight ahead, others looked down, but blind obedience had begun to show cracks. Eli stopped and turned back toward Hale. "You asked me for my call sign," he said, his voice still, even. "I answered." The brief statement placed responsibility back where it had begun. Hale clenched his jaw, said nothing. He could clearly feel the eyes of many people converging on him, waiting to see what he would do next. "Take him away," Hale repeated, this time faster, as if trying to end everything before it slipped out of control. The two guards reached out. At the moment their hands were about to touch Eli's arm, the sea wind surged through the oak canopy, leaves rustling. The sound unnaturally loud in the silence stretched to the point of discomfort. Just then, from From the shadow of the oak trees at the edge of the field, another voice rang out, low, roughened by years, but clear enough to cut through the movement. Wait. The sound was not loud, but it made everyone freeze by instinct. The guards halted mid-reach. Hale turned toward the source of the voice, his eyes narrowing. A figure stepped out of the shade, slow but decisive. The field lights fell across a face shaped by sea wind and time. That presence brought with it a completely different feeling. Not loud, not showy, but strong enough to alter the direction of the story. The parade ground held its formation, but the balance of authority had shifted. Hale stood there, realizing that his attempt at denial had not closed anything. On the contrary, it had opened another door, one through which survivors and buried memories were beginning to speak. A voice rang out from beneath the oak tree canopy, causing all movement on the parade ground to freeze. It was not loud, not harsh, but clear enough to cut across the orders currently being carried out. Stop. The two bodyguards standing in front of Eli reflexively halted mid-motion. One of them turned his head, as if to make sure he had not misheard. Richard Hale also turned toward the source of the sound, his initial irritation quickly shifting into alert caution. From the shadows beneath the oak tree, an elderly man stepped forward. He was not tall, his shoulders slightly sloped by the years, his silver hair neatly kept. He walked slowly, each step placed firmly, with no need to hurry. When the yard lights shone directly onto his face, several officers recognized him even before Hale could call out his name. Roy Miller, the administrative advisor they were accustomed to seeing quietly appear at internal meetings, reserved, unassuming, always seated at the margins. Roy approached Eli without looking at Hale right away. He placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, the grip heavy and solid, like a familiar signal between men who had shared too many long nights. Stop, Roy said again, this time more clearly, directing his words toward the two bodyguards. They looked at Hale, waiting for the next command. Hale frowned and stepped forward a pace, his voice sharpening. Roy, you are only an administrative advisor, he said, trying to maintain his commanding posture. This matter is not within your authority. The words were thrown out like a barrier, meant to push Roy back into his familiar position behind the scenes. Roy slowly turned toward Hale. His gaze was steady and calm, carrying no challenge, but showing no sign of retreat either. And I am a man whose life was saved by Night Fox, Roy said, evenly, without raising his voice. The sentence echoed across the parade ground, clear enough to make many people hold their breath. The parade ground began to stir. Whispers spread quickly, like ripples across water. Several young officers turned to one another, eyes wide. The name Night Fox had just been spoken again, this time no longer standing alone. It was now tied to a real person standing right in front of them. Their internal information systems began running, connecting fragments that no one had ever dared to question too deeply. Hale opened his mouth, but Roy continued, leaving no pause. Without him, I would have died in 1972, Roy said slowly. Each word was delivered clearly, unhurriedly, as if he wanted to be certain everyone heard. That night, we were surrounded. There was no route of retreat. He let us out, one by one. Roy paused, drawing in a short breath. I am alive because of Night Fox. The air seemed to sink under the weight of his words. An older officer lowered his head slightly, as if recalling something long buried. Another tightened his grip on the folder in his hands. Stories they had once heard only in passing, whispered in low voices during special training sessions, suddenly took on a sharper, more tangible form. You are overstepping your authority, Hale growled, trying to reclaim control. He stepped closer, standing directly opposite Roy, the distance between them no longer ceremonial. You have no right to speak of such matters before the entire unit. Roy did not avoid his gaze. No, he replied, his voice cold and decisive. I am telling the truth. The sentence was short, but it carried a weight that Hale could not dismiss with orders. Roy turned slightly, looking past the line of recruits, standing at attention. They deserve to know who they are standing in front of, he continued, not loudly, but clearly enough for the front ranks to hear. Hale felt the shift, distinctly. The officers' eyes began to change direction. Some no longer looked at him for instructions. They looked at Eli, then at Roy, then back at Hale, as if weighing two different kinds of authority, one drawn from present rank, and one forged from survival and truth carried across time. Roy, Hale said, lowering his voice, as if trying to pull the exchange back into private territory. We can discuss this later. Roy shook his head slightly. No, he said. Later is when everything gets buried again. The reply left Hale frozen for a brief moment. The two bodyguards still stood in front of Eli, but their hands had lowered. One of them glanced at Roy, then at Hale, his hesitation obvious. They understood that any move now could be re-examined later. The certainty behind the orders had vanished. Roy turned back to Eli, his expression softening quickly. I'm sorry I'm late, he said quietly, just loud enough for Eli to hear. Eli gave a very slight nod. You arrived at the right time, Eli replied. The brief exchange was simple, yet enough for those nearby to sense the bond between them. Hale took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He looked around, searching for support, but the familiar faces no longer reflected absolute agreement. A senior officer stepped forward, his voice cautious. Admiral, perhaps we should pause. Hale raised his hand, signaling silence, but the gesture no longer produced an immediate effect. Roy continued, not allowing Hale to reclaim the space. I am here in a personal capacity, he said, but I am also accountable to those who never returned. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the yard. The truth does not disappear just because we call it by another name. The sea wind grew stronger, rustling through the oak canopy. The American flag stretched taut, snapping sharply. The sound rang out in the increasingly heavy silence. Several recruits felt goosebumps rise on their skin. They did not fully understand what was unfolding, but they sensed that the order they had trusted had just been shaken. Hale stepped back half a pace, very slightly. He realized that simple denial was no longer enough. Every word Roy spoke pushed him deeper into a defensive position. What had once been locked away in classified reports now had someone willing to speak it aloud before a crowd. Roy stood upright, his arms relaxed at his sides. He did not need to advance further. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance. Eli stood beside him, silent, allowing Roy to speak his part. The parade ground held its formation, but the spirit had changed. It was no longer silence born of fear, but a tense waiting, signaling that what was coming could no longer be smothered by a few denials. Hale looked at the two men before him, then around him. He understood clearly that denial alone would not be enough to escape. A door had been opened, and behind it lay stories he had once believed were buried forever. The parade ground held its formation, but its breathing had changed. After Roy Miller's words, the distance between command and truth was stretched apart, exposing a gap that Richard Hale could no longer fully conceal. Eli stood beside Roy, his gaze fixed on the center of the ground, where power had just slipped from its familiar position. He slid a hand into his coat pocket, the movement slow and deliberate, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment ever since he passed through the base gate. I didn't come here just to visit a friend, Eli said, his voice clear, without needing to be raised. The sentence dropped into the taut silence, drawing the attention of the entire parade ground toward him. A few officers turned their heads. The recruits remained at attention, but their eyes were no longer locked on an invisible point ahead. Eli pulled out an envelope. It was small and old, the paper edges softened with age. He held it between two fingers, raising it just high enough for those nearby to see. This is from Jake Thompson's father, he continued. Jake's name rang out openly across the ground, no longer wrapped in whispers or cold reports. A wave of silence spread. The entire parade ground held its breath. Richard Hale reacted immediately. He stepped forward a beat, his voice snapping sharp and fast. That is an internal matter, Hale barked, trying to reclaim control through volume. No one is authorized to bring things like that out here. The words sounded like a familiar order, but their effect was no longer the same. A few officers glanced at Roy, then at Eli, and no one acted at once. Eli turned to Hale, his gaze cold and direct. No, he said, his voice low but firm. It is a death that was covered up. The answer was decisive, leaving no room for interpretation. A colonel standing near Hale swallowed hard. The words that had just been spoken crossed the safe boundary the system had built. Roy Miller stepped forward half a pace. He stood straighter, shoulders squared, as if taking on an added weight that had just been placed upon him. Jake was my nephew, Roy said, his voice turning hoarse. The statement shook the atmosphere in a completely different way. It did not require immediate proof because the confirmed relationship alone was enough to shatter the assumption that this was merely an emotional intervention. Hale took an unconscious step back. The movement was very small, but unmistakable. He looked at Roy, then at Eli, his eyes wavering. A young officer standing behind noticed, and quickly lowered his head, as if unwilling to be seen while the order of things was reversing. The system's reflexes were beginning to malfunction. Roy, what are you doing? Ali said, his voice lowered, trying to pull the exchange back to a controllable level. We have procedures for handling things like this. Roy did not answer right away. He stared straight at Hale, letting the silence do its work. Those around them felt the tension tighten, like a rope pulled beyond its limit. Eli brought the envelope closer, his grip steady. Jake's father sent it to me, he said, without looking at Hale. He trusted that I would not stay silent. The words carried no attack, but they placed a clear choice before everyone standing there. Silence or confrontation. Hale raised his hand, signaling to the nearby officers. Confiscate that envelope, he said, his voice trying to remain calm. Two men stepped forward, half a pace, then hesitated. Their eyes flicked past Roy, over the line of recruits, and settled on Eli. Certainty had drained from their movements. What do you think you're doing? Roy asked evenly. Keeping one more death in a sealed file. The question made one of the two officers stop completely. The other glanced at Hale, waiting for the order to be repeated, but Hale did not speak at once. He was calculating, searching for an exit. Eli looked down at the envelope, then back up. He drew in a short breath. Jake Thompson did not die by his own hand, he said, each word clear. He was pushed there. A few recruits in the back ranks felt a chill run down their spines. They remembered the endless training sessions, the limits constantly being tested. Jake's name was now bound to what they themselves had felt, but never dared to say aloud. Hale stepped forward, his voice growing harder. Enough, he said. You are breaking discipline. The words rang out, but this time they did not trigger an immediate response. A colonel turned to Hale, his tone cautious. Admiral, perhaps we should consider. Hale spun around, his gaze sharp. There is no need, he cut in. But that interruption no longer brought everything to a halt. Roy turned toward the line of recruits, then back to Eli. He isn't here anymore to speak, Roy said, his voice low. So we have to speak. The sentence was simple, but it spread quickly. A few older officers gave very slight nods. They had seen it too many times how the truth was pushed aside by procedure. Eli lifted the envelope a little higher. The parade ground lights shone on the worn paper surface. What's inside is not an apology, he said. It's not a sad story meant to earn sympathy. He paused for a beat. It's what you tried to hide. Hale stepped back another half pace. He realized that the gazes around him were changing. A few officers were no longer looking at him for orders. They were looking at the envelope. They were looking at Eli. They were looking at Roy. The power structure that relied on silence was steadily losing its grip. If you have ever seen a death labeled as depression to protect those in power, follow this through to the end. Eli placed a finger under the edge of the envelope. The movement was slow and deliberate. The soft sound of tearing paper was very faint, but in the present atmosphere, it rang out like a warning. Hale opened his mouth, but did not manage to speak. Roy stared at the envelope, his jaw clenched. The envelope began to open. What lay inside had not yet been revealed, but everyone understood that a boundary had just been crossed, not through shouting or orders, but through a letter from the dead, brought forward under the lights of the parade ground. Inside was not ordinary paperwork. It was evidence. As the sound of tearing paper faded, Eli's hand had already pulled out the object inside the envelope. A small USB drive, its metal casing lightly scratched, reflected the field lights as a cold streak. He raised it high, high enough for hundreds of people to see. Jake left everything here, Eli said, his voice even and clear. Without emphasis, the sentence cut through every attempt at delay, turning this moment into a point of no return. Richard Hale reacted instantly. He shouted, his voice sharp and rushed. Lies. The shout echoed across the field, striking the concrete walls and bouncing back. But this time, volume was no longer a weapon. It only exposed the disorder spreading fast. A few officers flinched, then stood still, as if waiting to see whether the next order would still carry force. Roy Miller stepped forward half a pace, standing level with Eli. Recordings, Roy said, his voice hoarse but steady. Journals, training orders. He listed each item slowly, as if reading from a carefully verified inventory. Times, dates, voices. Roy paused and looked straight at Hale, enough to cross-check. A young officer standing near the camera swallowed hard. Admiral, he began, his voice faltering, then fell silent when Hale spun around. Hale's eyes were sharp and fierce, but a trace of panic had appeared within them. He swept his gaze toward the internal camera, where the indicator light was still on, the lens still aimed at the center of the field. Turn off the camera, Hale barked, his arm swinging up by reflex. The order burst out like a habit long ingrained. The equipment operator looked around, hesitating. "Sir, the signal is being recorded live," he said quickly. "Procedure requires continuous archiving." Hale ground his teeth. "I gave an order," he growled, but the internal camera kept running. The indicator light did not go out. No one stepped forward to carry it out. Eli held the USB aloft for one more beat, then lowered it to Hale's eye level. "He was pushed to death," Eli said, his voice lower, but each word clear. It was not a rash accusation, but a conclusion laid on the table with data. A wave of murmurs broke out. Whispers spread rapidly through the ranks, overlapping and urgent. The parade ground lost its absolute silence for the first time since the beginning. "Order," Hale shouted, trying to pull the rhythm back. But this command no longer locked the crowd in place. A lieutenant colonel turned toward Hale, his voice cautious. "Admiral, if there is data, we should seal it and transfer it according to procedure." Hale snapped back, his eyes cutting the sentence short. "No need," he replied quickly. "This is manipulation." The response came too fast, making a few people nearby exchange glances. Roy tilted his head toward Eli, then faced Hale again. "He recorded every session," Roy said. "Training durations, instructions beyond thresholds, warnings ignored." He paused and took a short breath. "There are even segments where he said that if anything happened, this data had to be brought into the light." Roy did not raise his voice. That very calmness made the words heavier. An older officer stepped forward one pace, his voice low. "Admiral, we should suspend training operations." To Hale spun on him. "No," he cut in. "No one is suspending anything." But the voice had lost its firmness. Sweat beaded on his forehead, reflecting the lights. He wiped it away quickly, then dropped his hand when he realized how many eyes were fixed on him. "Jake Thompson," Eli said, speaking the full name, asked to rest. He looked across the ranks of recruits, then back at Hale. He was told that weakness was not permitted. Several recruits clenched their fists. They remembered the familiar phrases, the long nights, the feeling of backs and knees breaking down, and the shouted commands driving them on. Hale stepped forward, his voice harsh. "You are speculating." Eli shook his head very slightly. "Data does not speculate," he replied. "It records." Roy nodded and added, "There are timestamps. There are command signatures." That sentence made a few officers' faces change color. They understood what signatures meant. "Confiscate the USB," Hale ordered, his voice tight. Two guards stepped forward half a pace, then stopped. One glanced at the camera, then at Roy. The other looked at Hale, hesitating. "Admiral," he said quietly, "everything is being recorded." Hale narrowed his eyes. "Are you disobeying orders?" he asked. Neither answered. Their silence this time was not obedience. The murmuring grew louder. Some younger officers turned to one another, whispering quickly. "If there really are recordings, if there are orders." Fragmented phrases came together into a frightening picture. An order built on fear was wavering, replaced by another fear. The fear of standing on the wrong side. Roy stepped forward another half pace, positioning himself lightly in front of Eli. "We can do the right thing right now," Roy said, his voice deep. "Seal the data. Draft a report. Call an independent investigation." Hale let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think I will hand this base over to you?" Roy met his gaze. "I think you no longer have a choice." Hale turned back toward the recruits, trying to reclaim the stage. "You are being manipulated," he said loudly. "This is how the weak undermine discipline." The words fell into space. A few recruits did not lower their heads. They stood at attention, but their eyes had changed. They looked at the USB. They looked at Eli. They looked at Roy. They looked at Hale. "He was pushed to death," Eli repeated, this time more slowly, and he knew it. A lieutenant colonel turned toward Hale, his voice firm. "Admiral, with allegations like this, continuing to command right now is a risk." Hale glared. "Are you teaching me my job?" he asked. The officer remained silent, but did not step back. The internal camera continued recording. The indicator lights stayed on. The equipment operator looked at Hale, then at Roy, then at Eli, his hand gripping the control panel tightly. He understood that any action now would be scrutinized later. Truth, once it has images, is not easily erased. Eli lowered the USB, holding it in his palm. He looked straight at Hale, his gaze no longer distant. "You once taught people that the mission matters more than emotion," Eli said, "but you forgot that a mission does not permit killing people by order." The words made a few older officers briefly close their eyes. Hale stepped back half a pace, very slightly, but enough to reveal the loss of control. He looked at the USB, then at Eli, then at Roy. The space seemed to contract. The wind blew hard against the flagpole. The fabric stretched tight, the sound pounding like a countdown. Eli tilted his head, his voice dropping. "Do you remember Ramirez?" he asked. The name fell into the field, opening another door from the past. Hale flinched, his eyes tightening. The murmuring suddenly stalled, as if everyone had realized the story was not ending here. In that moment, the USB was no longer the only thing on the table. Another name had been spoken, signaling that what had been buried before was about to be dragged into the light, layer by layer. The name Ramirez still hung in the air when Eli took another step forward. He was not in a hurry, nor did he need to raise his voice. The parade ground lights fell across his face, clearly revealing the deep lines etched into it, marks of time and of decisions once made in circumstances that allowed no mistakes. Eli looked straight at Richard Hale, then spoke, slowly and clearly. "Thunderpup." Hale's body stiffened. The reaction happened before he had time to think. His eyes widened, his jaw clenched, as if the name just spoken had dragged him violently back to a moment he believed had been buried forever. The officers standing nearby noticed the change immediately. This was no longer the familiar anger, but a direct collision with the past. Eli did not stop. "Ramirez," he continued, his voice lower. "You remember, don't you?" The question did not require an answer. It was released like the final piece of a puzzle, placed exactly where it belonged. A few older officers frowned slightly, as if digging through their memories. The name Ramirez did not appear in recent training documents, but for those who had served long enough, it was a name once spoken in low voices, then erased. Roy Miller lowered his head. The movement was slow and heavy, as though he were carrying a familiar burden. "We buried him in silence," Roy said hoarsely. With the same conclusion, he lifted his head and looked straight at Hale. "Personal depression." The phrase was repeated, but this time it was no longer neutral. It carried a bitter irony. Hale shook his head hard, as if trying to throw off what had just been said. "You're making this up," he growled. "Those matters were dealt with a long time ago." But his voice lacked firmness, as though he were trying to convince himself more than those around him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, sliding down his temples. Eli took another half step forward. The distance between them was now close enough for Hale to feel his breath. "I gave you a chance to correct yourself," Eli said, his voice tightening, not loud but sharp. "I believed you understood what the boundaries were." He paused, his eyes never leaving Hale. "I was wrong." That statement caused the parade ground to sway slightly. A few young officers glanced at one another, not fully understanding the context, but they felt the weight of the admission. A man who once had the authority to give others a chance was now standing there, saying that chance had been betrayed. Hale burst out, his voice breaking into a shout. "You have no right to judge me." He stepped forward, fists clenched, as if trying to fill the space with his familiar aggression. "Who are you to stand here, in front of me, and talk about morality?" Hale's gaze swept across the crowd, searching for support, but the faces looking back at him were no longer the same. "Jake is the proof," Eli replied, his voice cold and decisive. No further explanation was needed. The name Jake Thompson was enough to end any theoretical argument. It was tied to data, to the USB drive in Eli's hand, to the recordings and training orders that had been mentioned earlier. It pulled the present and the past closer together, revealing a clear, repeating pattern. Hale turned his head toward the guards. "Remove them," he said, his voice low but taut. The two guards standing there did not move. One glanced at his partner, then looked at Hale. Hesitation was plain in his eyes. The other looked at Roy, then at Eli, then turned away, as if avoiding Hale's gaze. The order had been given, but no one carried it out. "What are you doing?" Hale snarled, clearly feeling control slipping from his grasp. "I am the commanding officer." One guard swallowed hard. "Sir, Admiral," he said quietly, "everything is being recorded." The statement was not confrontational, but it stood like an invisible wall. Hale understood its meaning. Any action taken now would be reviewed, frame by frame, sound by sound. Roy stepped forward, standing level with Eli. "Ramirez died during a similar training cycle," Roy said, his voice steady but heavy. "Constant pressure, ignored warnings, then a conclusion of depression." He shook his head slightly. "We believed it was an individual mistake." Roy looked up, his eyes sharpening. "Jake shows it is a pattern." A lieutenant colonel stepped forward, his tone cautious. "Sir, Admiral, if there is precedent, we need to report this up the chain." Hale spun around. "Are you siding with them?" he asked, his voice mixed with anger and disbelief. The officer held his gaze. "I am siding with procedure," he replied. The answer prompted a few very slight nods. Eli looked around the ground. The line of recruits still stood at attention, but their eyes were no longer empty. Some looked at Hale with wariness, others looked at Eli with curiosity. mixed with respect. They were witnessing something rare, a moment when power was forced to confront the consequences of its own actions. Hale turned back to face Eli. "You think you can destroy everything with a few names and a USB drive," he said hoarsely. "This base, this career, does not operate that way." Eli nodded very slightly. "I know," he replied. "It operates in silence." He paused, "and that silence has killed people." A strong gust of wind swept across the ground. The American flag snapped taut, producing a dry, rapid sound. The noise rang out in the stillness like a countdown. Hale stood there, in the vast parade ground, clearly sensing the shift. Those who once clustered around him, waiting for orders, RS now stood still, watching, weighing their choices. A young officer took half a step back, unconsciously. Another crossed his arms over his chest, not in standard posture, yet not corrected. Small details, but together they formed a clear message. The system was beginning to turn away. Hale raised a hand to adjust his collar, a familiar gesture he used to regain composure. This time, it did nothing. He looked around, searching for certainty, but saw only faces waiting to see what would happen next. There was no longer absolute protection from rank, no longer a safe zone. Eli stood straight, his expression steady. "Thunderpup once begged me to cover it up," he said, his voice low. "I believed you would learn." Eli shook his head. "Jake shows you learned nothing." The words carried no anger, yet they were heavier than any shouted accusation. Hale did not respond. He stood in the middle of the ground, lights shining straight down, with nowhere left to hide. The guards remained in place, neither advancing nor retreating. The officers looked at one another, then at Hale, then turned away. The old order had fractured. The system Hale once relied on was withdrawing its protection, bit by bit. In that moment, Hale understood clearly. He was standing alone, in the middle of the vast parade ground, abandoned by the very system he had once manipulated. The parade ground was so silent that every breath could be heard. Richard Hale stood in the pool of light, his shoulders once habitually tense, with authority now sagging heavily. He swayed slightly, as if the ground had shifted beneath him, then collapsed. One knee struck the concrete, followed by the other. His breathing turned rapid and labored, the sound mingling with the sea wind blowing hard past the flagpole. The scene unfolded slowly and unmistakably before hundreds of people who still held formation, though their spirit had already departed from the old mold. Dusk blanketed the parade ground in a deep crimson hue, thick and heavy, reflecting off the concrete, off the shoes, standing at attention, off the American flag stretched tight in the wind. That light sharpened every contour, making this moment impossible to confuse with a temporary mishap. This was a public collapse, unfolding in a place meant to display order. Eli stood a few steps away from Hale. He did not move closer, nor did he turn away. His gaze retained the calm that had accompanied him throughout the afternoon. "Silence kills," Eli said, his voice low and even. The words were not meant to humiliate. They were delivered as a conclusion, meant for everyone witnessing the scene. Roy Miller stood beside him, arms relaxed, eyes fixed on Hale, heavy but resolute. Several young officers looked at Hale with eyes that had clearly changed. The reverence once cultivated through commands gave way to contempt and caution. They had witnessed the progression from humiliation to denial, from denial to panic, from panic to collapse. They understood that the power which had once forced them to bow could dissolve that quickly when truth was placed where it belonged. A lieutenant colonel stepped forward, maintaining an appropriate distance. "Admiral," he said, his tone strictly procedural, "given the current situation, I recommend that you relinquish temporary command authority." Hale lifted his head for a brief moment. His eyes were empty, as if searching for a familiar answer that was no longer there. He nodded very slightly, a small gesture, but enough to confirm that the stage had closed. The internal cameras continued recording. Indicator lights glowed steadily. The technician in charge stood motionless, both hands gripping the control panel, aware that these frames would not be erased. They would accompany the files, the investigation, the questions, and the system would be forced to answer. In the days that followed, everything moved quickly and heavily. A brief announcement was issued. Richard Hale resigned due to personal responsibility in matters of command. The wording was dry, but sufficient to confirm what everyone had already seen. An independent committee was established to review the entire SEAL training program at Little Creek. Training schedules were suspended, files sealed, and interviews initiated. Names that had previously appeared only in internal reports were now spoken aloud in closed meeting rooms. With unprecedented caution, Roy Miller participated in the sessions as a witness. He spoke slowly and clearly, adding nothing extraneous. He mentioned Ramirez, recalled warnings that had been ignored, and recalled how a diagnosis of depression had been used to close every question. Each statement lengthened the list of inquiries. Officers who had once stood silent began to be called in not for immediate punishment, but to confront the choices they had made. Eli was offered an honorary distinction, a formal advisory position, and prepared expressions of gratitude. He listened, then shook his head. He did not need another title. He said that what needed to be done was finished, and the rest belonged to those still serving. The decision surprised some, but no one objected. They understood that Eli had never sought a stage. On another afternoon, when the parade ground had returned to a more familiar rhythm, Eli stood before a group of recruits. There were no cameras, no speeches. He looked at them, young faces, tension and expectation intertwined. "Do not stay silent when you see something wrong," Eli said. The sentence was short, but enough to remain. Roy stood beside him and nodded very slightly. The sea wind passed through, carrying the familiar scent of salt. The American flag flew steadily, no longer as rigid as it had been the day before. The order was gradually rebuilt, this time with visible cracks that forced the system to change how it functioned. No one claimed everything would be perfect, but a new boundary had been drawn by truth, by data, by names spoken at the right moment. Richard Hale left the base in silence. No sirens, no cameras following. The metal gate opened, then closed. The road ahead was no longer shielded by rank. Consequences began there, quietly but relentlessly, exactly the way truth tends to operate. Back at Little Creek, training programs were redesigned. Safety thresholds were clearly documented. Warnings were required to be acknowledged. Difficult conversations were encouraged rather than suppressed. Not everyone was pleased, but no one could say they did not know. The story closed on the parade ground, where the light had softened, where order was rebuilt from fragments. Eli walked out through the gate slowly, the same way he had entered. Roy walked with him for a short distance, saying little. They understood each other through things that did not need to be repeated. If you believe that power must be monitored, share this story. And as night fell, one question still hung in the air, persistent and uncomfortable. How many other deaths had once been labeled as depression?